All right, today we're going to talk about a case that really pushed forensic science to its absolute limits. I mean, this was a crime so carefully planned, it was literally designed to be unsolvable. So, yeah, let's just dive right in.
So picture this. It's March of 1988. We're on a frozen roadside in a quiet, rural part of Canada just outside Toronto. And this is where homicide detective Larry Edgar gets a call that's about to kick off one of the most bizarre and complex investigations of his entire career. Yeah, that's Detective Edgar himself, and what he found, well, it wasn't just a body. It was the start of a horrifying puzzle, like a human jigsaw scattered across the landscape. And then, a second leg is found not far away. So the investigation is on, but think about it. They have no victim, no crime scene, they have absolutely no idea who they're even looking for. And that right there is the huge problem they're facing. The killer didn't just dump the body. No, they systematically took it apart, piece by piece. They were actively trying to beat the very science investigators use to catch criminals. So, right from the get-go, the investigators knew this was something else. This wasn't like any case they'd ever handled. The person who did this wasn't just brutal. They were smart, methodical. They knew exactly what they were doing.
Okay, just look at this list. This lays out the killer's strategy, and it's chillingly brilliant. Every single thing here is a direct counterattack on standard forensic work. Draining the blood, that makes identification almost impossible. Removing the head and hands, well, there go your dental records and fingerprints. The surgical precision of it all, that points to someone with serious skill. And then scattering the parts, that was to make sure the victim was never found, or at least never put back together and identified. And they brought in an anatomy professor to look at the remains, and he confirmed their worst fears. This was no amateur. The cuts were just too clean. They were made by someone who knew precisely where the joints were. They realized they were up against a killer with a very rare, very specific set of skills.
But here's the thing. Even the smartest, most careful killer leaves something behind. So the investigation had to pivot. They were going to have to rely on some pretty cutting-edge forensics to try and give this victim her name back.
So, no fingerprints, right? So what do? Well, the investigators turned to the victim's feet. You know, the ridges on the soles of our feet, they're just as unique as our fingerprints. And believe it or not, a specialist managed to lift a print from one of the feet they found. It told them the victim was a woman who wore a size 8 shoe. I mean, it's not a name, but it's their first real solid lead. They had an individual now.
And then came the next breakthrough, and this one was just, wow. The blood work came back and it showed the victim had this incredibly rare mix of blood groups. The chances of finding someone else in the entire province of Ontario with that same combination, 1 in a million. This was huge. It took our anonymous victim and made her a statistically unique person.
And this is where all those little forensic details just click into place. The police get a tip about a missing person, a talented violinist named Selena Shen. And guess what? She wore a size 8 shoe. So investigators go to her apartment and they find some underwear with a blood stain. The lab runs it and it's a 1 in a million match to the remains. At the exact same time, a footprint expert uses this argon laser, some really cool tech, to lift a faint print from inside one of Selena's shoes. It's a perfect match to the print from the recovered foot. Boom! They had their victim. Her name was Selena Shen.
Okay, so now that they know who the victim is, the whole investigation just pivots. The question becomes, who in Selena's life could have done something this horrible? And pretty much right away, all eyes turned to her boyfriend.
So at first, investigators had a couple of people they were looking at. There was this guy, Robert Fizzer, a university instructor Selena had met for some advice, and then there was her boyfriend, Ruin Pan. But when you look at them side by side, the stories are just night and day. Friends said Pan was super controlling, jealous. They even claimed he'd wiretapped her phone. Apparently, she was terrified of him. Fizzer, on the other hand, he just had one brief public meeting with her. So yeah, the suspicion started to really focus in on Pan.
And then came the bombshell, the absolute game changer. It came from Pan's own stuff. The police found these documents written in Chinese. They get them translated, and you're not going to believe this. They were his report cards from a medical school in China. And his grades, they were amazing, specifically in things like pathology and blood transfusions. The exact skills you'd need to perform a clean, bloodless dismemberment. This guy, this quiet shopkeeper, he had advanced medical training. He wasn't just a suspect anymore. He was the prime suspect.
Now, a lot of the evidence was circumstantial, but the police, they were pretty sure they had their guy. The problem was proving it. So, Detective Edgar comes up with a plan. He decides to set a trap to see if he can force Pan to make a mistake.
And the plan was honestly pretty brilliant because of how simple it was. First, they announced to the public that they've identified the victim as Selina Shen. This sends a direct message to Pan. Your plan to hide her identity? It didn't work. The thinking was, if he still had any evidence lying around, like the murder weapons or maybe even the rest of her remains, this news would panic him. He'd feel the pressure and try to get rid of it. And of course, the police would be watching every single move he made. And you know what? It worked! Like perfectly! The very next night, surveillance teams are on him, and they follow Pan as he goes for this late-night drive. There was even an undercover cop pretending to be a homeless guy who watched Pan walk all the way to the end of a dark pier and throw a bag into the freezing water of Lake Ontario. Pan thought he was totally alone, but he had just led the police right to the evidence they've been looking for. So they call him the police dive team, like right away. Imagine this. It's pitch black, the water's freezing cold, and they're doing this careful grid search on the lake bottom. One of the divers even talked about this really eerie moment where his glove just comes up out of the darkness, and he's holding a knife. In the end, they pulled up a whole set of 5 cheap kitchen knives, the kind made in China.
Finding the knives was a massive break, for sure, but they still had to connect those specific knives to Pan and to the murder. And this is where a little bit of forensic magic, and maybe Pan's own arrogance, finally sealed the deal.
The technology here is just so cool. I mean, think about it. Getting a fingerprint off a knife that's been sitting at the bottom of a lake? It sounds impossible. But what they did was they fumed the knives with superglue vapor and then looked at them under an argon laser. And incredibly, a specialist found this tiny, faint bit of ridge detail on the very tip of one of the blades. And it was a perfect match to ruin Pan's fingerprint.
And if that wasn't enough, this was the final nail in the coffin. The police had been wiretapping Pan's house, and on the very night he chucked those knives in the lake, he has this long, rambling talk with some friends. And in this conversation, he starts talking about how someone could commit the perfect murder. He's asking these so-called hypothetical questions, like, what murder weapon did you use, and are there your fingerprints on this knife? I mean, come on. For the prosecutors, this was basically a confession. He was describing his own crime.
Now, even with all this powerful evidence, getting justice was a real battle. Pan's first trial actually ended in a hung jury. Can you believe it? The second one was declared a mistrial for legal reasons. But finally, on the third try, a new team of prosecutors laid out all the complex forensic evidence, played the wiretaps, and the jury came back with a verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. You know, Rui Wen Pan was so sure he'd committed the perfect crime. He really believed he had outsmarted science itself. But when you boil it all down, a single footprint, a 1 in a million blood type, and one tiny, invisible fingerprint were enough to completely tear his plan apart. It really makes you think, doesn't it? This case was solved, but how many other killers out there who were just as clever actually got away with it?